Hello and welcome back. Once again, I'm your instructor, Lukas, and today we'll be looking at methods for incorporating the information from your research into your paper, drawn from Chapter 9, Using Research, in the textbook I wrote, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies. There are three basic methods for including information in your paper. You can quote, you can paraphrase, or you can summarize. Many students fall back on directly quoting all of their information in papers, either because it's so easy, you just have to copy and paste, because they're not sure how else to include the information, or because they think that quotes show they did their research. However, quotes are not how you show that you did your research. Citations are. While you should definitely cite all of your sources, you should definitely not quote all of them. In reality, you want most of the information in your paper to be in your own words, paraphrased or summarized, for several reasons. First, it gives you control over emphasis, persuasive phrasing, and so on. We've already talked about the fact that how you say something can affect your reader's opinion or judgment unconsciously. It makes it flow better than a bunch of quotes stuck together, which is often choppy. And finally, it makes you sound like an authority, which increases your credibility and your believability. No matter which of the three methods you choose, there are a few things to keep in mind. One is that no matter what, you have to cite. Citation shows what's borrowed information, so anytime you give a fact, you should be letting your reader know where you got it from, to show that you didn't just make it up. In addition, no matter what type you use, you should keep in mind that it is only the I in a pie paragraph, so it must have a topic sentence and an analysis or explanation. How does this fact help to prove your point? Why is it relevant? You should always lead into facts and quotations gracefully. Any quote in your paper should be part of a complete grammatical sentence and should make sense. This is also true of summarized or paraphrased information, although it's usually easier with these forms since they use your own words. When you begin a sentence with a signal phrase like, according to Dr. Smith, a noted psychologist, you not only make the citation smoother, it also allows you to say more about the source and helps to orient the reader. Being able to mention the person's credentials or other relevant information about them makes the information more compelling than simply a bare citation. Make sure that the information flows like a paragraph rather than being choppy like a list. Finally, no matter what method you use to incorporate it, you need to make sure that you're being selective. Don't use information just because it's cool or interesting or sort of related. Make sure that you're using it to help prove a relevant and meaningful argument within your essay. Now that you have a grounding and some information that applies to all of the methods, let's take some time to look at each in detail. Quotation means using the source's exact words. However, exact does mean that the words have to be used exactly. You have to get everything right, to the point that even if the source made a mistake in spelling, punctuation, or grammar, you're not allowed to fix it. You have to faithfully reproduce the error. However, you don't want the reader to think that it was you who put it in on accident, so to show that you're faithfully reproducing an error that was part of the original, you follow it with square brackets and SIC. It means thus or so in Latin, but there are lots of backronyms to explain it. A backronym is when you make an acronym out of a word that isn't. My favorite for this is so incorrect. Others include same in copy, or spelling intentionally conserved. The square brackets show that it is you, the author, talking, and not part of the quote. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So then, I mentioned that most of your information should be in your own words. When do you think it would be better to use quotations rather than your own words? When the information is especially memorable, authoritative, strongly emotional, or extremely well phrased. Basically, only quote when you would lose meaning or impact by paraphrasing. A few exceptions and other information to note about using quotations. First, do not use quotation marks when you're saying something that couldn't be stated any other way, such as a statistic or someone's title, since there's nothing original in the statement of expression. Earlier, I said you had to use the quote exactly, but sometimes you want to adjust it to make it fit better in your paper, and you can do that through use of the ellipsis and square bracket. For instance, sometimes the author says something that's clear in context, but is no longer clear when you take it out of that context. They used it, for example. You can use square brackets to show that you're breaking in and adding something to the quote so that you can replace it with what it is in brackets, as you can see in the example here. I couldn't believe it could happen to me versus I couldn't believe cancer could happen to me. We'll see an example of this in action in a few more slides. Other times, you only want to use part of what the author says, or you want to use just the beginning or end of a sentence, or sentences 2 and 5, but not the ones in between. You can leave out as much or as little information as you want by indicating that something is missing with an ellipsis. Just like it tells you something is missing in to be continued, it does the same in a quote. But don't change the meaning. No, I would never endorse gay marriage to I would ... endorse gay marriage. You are required to be true to the original meaning. The use of the ellipsis and the square brackets will be demonstrated in a few more slides as well. Quotation punctuation can be kind of complicated. I encourage you to look over quotation punctuation on pages 252 to 253 of the textbook, but for now I simply want to remind you to replace a period with a comma when needed, as the example here shows, where the period after heartbreaking has been replaced with a comma, with the period for the sentence coming after the parenthetical citation. Finally, remember to format long quotes correctly. If you have a quote that will be more than 5 lines long in your paper, the first thing you should do is reconsider. Do you really need the whole thing? Could you use just part, or paraphrase or summarize? However, if you do decide you really need it, it gets special formatting. The rules are explained in full on page 253 to 254 of your textbook, but for now I want to just briefly go over the basics. End the sentence before it with a colon, indent the entire quote 1 inch, end with citation, then continue the paragraph with no new indent, since it is still the same paragraph. And you will always follow it, since information, which any quote obviously is, should be followed by your own comments or explanation. Anytime you end a paragraph with a citation, it's a clear sign you're missing the analysis, or the E in a pie paragraph. Paraphrasing is basically including all of the information, but putting it in your own words. However, what people own copyright over is their, quote, expression of an idea, end quote. And there is more to an expression than just the words themselves. Syntax, sentence structure, and word order are all part of it. So going through with a thesaurus and replacing each word with a synonym isn't good enough. In the text, I've included 3 methods you can use: natural, social, and mechanical. In the natural method, you reread the quote to refresh your mind about what it says. Then, put it down, because while you're staring at it, it's hard to think of any other way to say it. Then, reread the part of your essay right before it, both so that you forget the exact words and only retain the general idea or meaning, and so that what you write will flow with what's already there. Then, write down the information in your words, and finally, double check you got the information right and your paraphrase is not too close to the original. In the social method, you record yourself explaining to a friend, which can be great for those who are good at talking but feel blocked or inhibited while writing. Explaining something to someone else is also an excellent way of understanding it more deeply yourself. The mechanical method replaces key words with synonyms and plays around with sentence structure and word order. As I say in your textbook, quote, your paraphrase is complete when it captures your understanding in your own language and is not simply the original with synonyms, end quote. In almost all cases, most of the information you use in your paper should be paraphrased rather than quoted or summarized for the reasons explained at the beginning of this video lecture. Summary is just condensing the information, leaving some out, and putting it all in your own words. We've already discussed summary in the reading chapter on pages 155 through 159, and there are suggestions for how to summarize both there and in the section in this chapter on summarizing on page 256. So what I want to emphasize here is the difference between assigned summary and summary as a way to include information in your paper. A summary only includes important information. When a teacher assigns you a summary, what is important is what was important to the original author, so you have to include all of the main ideas. However, when it's for your own paper, everything that's important becomes only what is important for your paper. In addition, just like with the patterns of development, where your choice of what to include for every single pattern is dependent on your point or purpose, you only include the info that is relevant to your point, so that you can leave out a lot of what the author thought was important. Be selective. All the methods, paraphrasing, summarizing, and quoting, have their place and their strengths, and you should think carefully about which method to use, avoiding falling back automatically on quoting, as we'll see with the second example. I also want to remind you that no matter which method you choose, you need to explain that E and pi to your readers what they were supposed to have gotten from the quote, what the connection is to your argument. Okay, let's look at these different strategies for including information in action. Here's a passage from science fiction writer and scholar James Gunn's essay, Harry Potter as a School Days Novel. The situation and portrayal of Harry as an ordinary child with an extraordinary talent make him interesting. He elicits our sympathy at every turn. He plays a Cinderella-like role as the abused child of mean-spirited foster parents who favor other, less worthy children, and also fits another fantasy role, that of changeling. Millions of children have nursed the notion they cannot be the offspring of such unremarkable parents. In the Harry Potter books, the metaphor is often the literal truth. Now, while the ideas here may be new and interesting, the phrasing is not, and there's kind of a lot of it. It seems most of it could be profitably paraphrased or summarized. Let's take a look at how that might look. One paraphrase version reads, according to filmmaker James Gunn, notice the use of a signal phrase. According to filmmaker James Gunn, the circumstances and depiction of Harry Potter as a normal boy with special abilities captivate us by playing on our empathy. Gunn observes that, like Cinderella, Harry is scorned by his guardians, who treat him far worse than they treat his less admirable peers. And like another fairy tale figure, the changeling, Harry embodies the fantasies of children who refuse to believe that they were born of their undistinguished parents. There are a couple of things to note here. One is that this is a paraphrase in that it includes all of the same information from the original passage. However, it starts with a signal phrase that lets us know who James Gunn is and why he might know what he's talking about. We can see that not only are there replacements of individual words, such as replacing the situation and portrayal of Harry with the circumstances and depiction of Harry Potter, but we also see that the sentences have changed. What was the first two sentences in the original is now a single sentence. I encourage you to pause the video lecture for a moment to compare the two versions, seeing how not only the word choice, but the sentence divisions and flow are different as well. The style of expression is different, beyond just replacing individual words, though that is often the most noticeable. One last thing I'd like to say about this paraphrase before we move on is about the points it's making. There are essentially two, one about Harry being like Cinderella, and one about Harry being essentially switched at birth. However, if you did want to include both of these ideas in an essay, I would encourage you to separate them and discuss Cinderella in one paragraph and being a changeling in a second, since they are two different points, regardless of whether or not your source discusses them in a single paragraph. Now, if you're ready, we'll look at a summarized version of the same content. The summary reads, filmmaker James Gunn observes that Harry Potter's character is compelling because readers empathize with Harry's fairy tale-like plight as an orphan whose gifts are ignored by his foster parents. Again, notice that both the paraphrase and the summary include a signal phrase leading into the information and a page number citation. The author's name isn't needed because he's mentioned in the signal phrase, so it's obvious. Notice how both the paraphrase and the summary indicate whose ideas they are with the signal phrases according to James Gunn and James Gunn Observes, and show with the page number citations where Gunn's ideas end. This leads into the quote smoothly so readers know who is talking. You can also use signal phrases to indicate credentials. Phrases like, former police officer Sam Johnson argues, or psychologist Mary Peter points out that, can give additional credibility to your information, as well as serving as a transitional bridge. You can also see in the summary that not all of the information from the original is included. Apparently, the ideas about Cinderella are relevant to this paper, but the changeling idea isn't, or else it's going to be discussed somewhere else. However, extended versions of quoting, paraphrasing, and summary are only the most basic use. A more complex use can be made of these tools by using them in bits and pieces and combining them together. Let's look at another version of an original passage that could be found during research. Illiterates cannot travel freely. When they attempt to do so, they encounter risks that few of us can dream of. They cannot read traffic signs, and, while they often learn to recognize and to decipher symbols, they cannot manage street names which they haven't seen before. The same is true for bus and subway stops. While ingenuity can sometimes help a man or woman discern directions from familiar landmarks, buildings, cemeteries, churches, and the like, most illiterates are virtually immobilized. They seldom wander past the streets and neighborhoods they know. Geographical paralysis becomes a bitter metaphor for their entire existence. They're immobilized in almost every sense we can imagine. They can't move up, they can't move out, they cannot see beyond. Now, this is extremely long and rather repetitive, certainly not something that should be directly quoted in its entirety. However, it does have some good bits, and it can be used to show some more advanced ways to incorporate information, as we'll see on the next slide. One way you might approach the passage would be to combine a summary of most of the information with a quotation of a particularly striking phrase. It might look something like this. Distinguished writer and educator Jonathan Kozol points out that due to inability to read signs, people who are illiterate often can't leave their own neighborhoods, which is, quote, a bitter metaphor for their entire existence, end quote. Again, we get a signal phrase and a citation, but we can see how this combination of methods can bring out the strengths in your source material. Another, more advanced way of manipulating source material is to use square brackets and ellipses, as you can see in this second example. Although illiteracy creates serious problems in many aspects of a person's life, its effect on mobility is particularly devastating. As distinguished writer and educator Jonathan Kozol puts it, quote, illiterates cannot travel freely, they cannot read traffic signs, and cannot manage street names they haven't seen before. As a result, most illiterates are virtually immobilized. You can see how the comment leading into the information makes clear what the point is. We can guess the thesis of the paper just from this one sentence. We also get a signal phrase indicating why we should listen to the author. Notice as well that even though things were chopped up, it sounded like a clear grammatical sentence when I read it out loud, which is true of any quote. Read it out loud, it should be part of a clear, complete, and grammatical sentence. The square brackets were used to indicate a transition I needed to make it grammatical, which is the most common use of them, to adjust a quote so that it fits into a grammatical sentence. The ellipses were used to include only the information that was most important and most needed. Also, I would remind you that these are only 2 ways to work with source information. There are many ways you can use these techniques to shape and strengthen your presentation of your source information. I hope that the discussions and information contained in this video and the textbook chapter were helpful and illuminating. Thank you for joining me for an overview on how to incorporate research information into your paper. Please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions you may have about the material. I'm always happy to help.